All right, so this is the introduction to chapter 6, which covers the history of life on Earth from the origin of life to plants during the Archean Eon to the Proterozoic Eon, which was about 3.8 billion to 600 million years ago. And this timeline shows the Proterozoic Eon, which was after the Archean Eon. You can see here's the end of the Archean Eon, the Neo-Archean. So the Proterozoic Eon began about 2.5 billion years ago. And then it ended just before the Cambrian here. And previously, people had thought that the first plants appeared after the Cambrian, but now with molecular clock analysis, they're thinking that the plants appeared before the Cambrian. But it doesn't agree with the fossil record. The fossil record indicates that the first plants appeared after the Cambrian. So the Cambrian's when the animals appeared in the sea, and then the plants, they thought appeared after the animals, but now they're understanding that they probably appeared before the animals, even though they haven't found the fossils. So it's an area of controversy. You know, some people are still saying that plants appeared in the Silurian after the Cambrian. Other people are saying before. So I had an interesting conversation one time, but because I'm a biosystems engineer with a focus on algae and plants, I worked for about 15 years on large research teams that focused on improving the production rate of algae for biofuels and desert plants for rubber. And I worked with many illustrious researchers, you know, like world known sort of people in the fields of plant science and soil science. And as much as they hate to admit it, they still needed an engineer. That's what I am. And as much as I hate to admit it, I needed plant scientists and soil scientists. These large research projects, you have large groups of people working together in order to accomplish goals. Ours was to improve the production rate of algae for biofuels and plants for, we were actually growing desert plants for rubber. But one day during a conversation, one of the plant scientists said with an air of finality and triumph, plants were first, meaning that plants evolved before animals. And maybe he was just being funny, but I don't think I'm exaggerating about his joy over the fact that plants were before animals in the sequence of evolution. And the curious thing to me was that he made this claim, even though there's this disagreement between the molecular clock analysis, where they look at the genomes and figure out, you know, when things began, and it's called molecular clock, and the fossil record. And so I looked into it. As part of these groups, I learned quite a bit about genetics, just listening to all their presentations. And I think I agree with my plant scientist colleague that there's a level of confidence that land plants appeared before animals. And I think the key is green algae. That's actually the type of algae that we were growing. And the key is that there are many species of green algae that evolved at the same time as land plants, and they're very similar. In fact, they sometimes classify green algae as land plants and vice versa. So with all of these other examples of very similar species, they can look at the rate that their DNA changed, and then they can say that, well, plants probably had the same rate of change of DNA. So that's what you would call a calibrated molecular clock, where they have a lot of examples of very similar things, and they can track how all their genomes are changing. So they can say, well, plants probably changed at that rate. So I think that the molecular clock analysis of plants is valid and probably is correct. So we'll begin with a historical perspective on the origin of life. And of course, we begin with Aristotle. And then after that, before diving into origin of life research, we'll review the building blocks of life, which are organic compounds. And then we're going to take 4 sections on different aspects of origin of life research. We'll look at the chemistry of the origin of life. We'll look at the RNA world hypothesis. We'll look at protocell formation, which form naturally in the environment. And then we'll look at another technique that scientists use. So those were all laboratory methods where they evaluated these things in the laboratory. Then we'll look at another technique that scientists use to look at the origin of life. And that's to look at what they think were early organisms. And we'll look at this one called, I can't remember the name of it, Halobacteria halobium. I have it on the slide. It has a certain protein that gets energy from the sun and then sends hydrogen in a certain direction. So it would be a very simple example of photosynthesis. And then we'll look at the algae and plant fossil record. And this picture is sort of how I imagine early life beginning. This is a picture of moss. And so you can see there's basically no soil. This is just some sort of volcanic outflow, or no, some sedimentary outflow. And you have this moss growing on it at the interface between a river where algae first began and the soil. Moss doesn't put down roots, it just grows on the surface. So anyway, that's how I imagine the first plants looking. So that would be at the end of this lecture, where we're looking at the first land plants. And then after that, we'll look at some other evolutionary sequences in plants, or at least the chapter does, all the way up to the final phase of plants, which was flowering and fruit trees. So as we've done before, we'll begin this discussion of the origin of life with Aristotle. So Aristotle believed in the spontaneous generation of life from non-life, which means he thought that life could instantaneously form from non-living matter. And so he thought that mollusks form from mud. So here's some mollusks. So he thought that they just spontaneously generated in these substances. He thought that clams formed from sand, worms from snow, and bacteria from decaying matter. And he said, animals and plants are formed in the earth and in water because there is water in earth and spiritus in water and soul heat in all spiritus, so that all things are in a way full of soul. And spontaneous generation became the accepted paradigm in ancient Greece and Rome, and later in the Middle Ages. And Jews, Christians, and Muslims were all comfortable with it because scriptures seem to state that the earth and seas had the capability to naturally bring forth life. And so they thought that God gave inanimate matter the intrinsic capability to generate life from non-life. And with this in mind, it's curious that many people believe or view evolution of life from chemicals as an atheistic concept. So things have really switched. So abiogenesis is the spontaneous generation of life from non-living matter. And it was one of those unassailable beliefs of the pre-scientific period, like geocentrism. And not only did they think Aristotle and Moses endorsed it, but people observed what they thought were solid examples of the spontaneous generation of life from inanimate matter. For example, they thought that rats formed in dirty underwear. And the proof of this was that rats appeared out of nowhere on ships. And another belief was that maggots spontaneously originated in meat. And it would be easy to believe this. Who wouldn't believe that this maggot right here, spontaneously generated in this piece of meat? Then scientists began to conduct experiments, and the first was in 1668 when Francesco Redi used these covered and uncovered containers. So he put meat in covered container and uncovered container. And he showed that maggots only developed on the uncovered containers, and he showed that flies were landing on the meat. So he showed that the maggots came from fly eggs. So this was the first of a long series. So this is 1668. It wasn't finally disproven until 200 years later, when Louis Pasteur conducted his experiments in 1860. Okay, so here's Louis Pasteur. And so he conducted these experiments in these swan-necked flasks. And what he did was he heated up this broth. So he purified it, but it was a broth, so it had organic material that bacteria could grow on. So he heated it up in all these cases, but he had this swan-necked flask where if any air came in, the microbes would settle out in this low point, and then the air would keep going without the microbes. So he showed that in the swan-necked flask, where the microbes couldn't get to the broth, there was no growth of bacteria. So this showed that the bacteria was coming from the air. And so he had two other experiments, one where he broke off the swan neck and he just allowed air to enter. And so he had bacteria growing in that broth. And then another experiment where he tipped it over and he allowed the air to reach the bacteria here. And so he had bacteria growing in that broth. So this experiment finally convinced almost everybody that abiogenesis was not true. And so people had a very strong belief that life could not arise from non-life. And even Darwin was convinced of biogenesis. Biogenesis is the belief that life can only come from life. And in 1859, when he published his book on the origin of species, he said that God must have created the first cell. But later, he considered in a letter to Hooker, who was another famous biologist at the time, that life might have begun in a pool of organic chemicals. So he kind of switched back. He'd been very strongly influenced by Pasteur's experiment, but he started thinking, well, maybe that's not true. And with respect to modern experiments on evolution, the difference between Pasteur's experiments and the modern concept of evolution is that Pasteur had no way to test whether life could evolve from non-life over millions of years. So two scientists in the early 20th century reinvigorated the theory of abiogenesis, which is that life comes from non-life, and they were both atheists. On the left, you can see Alexander Oparin, who's wearing the Soviet medal of the workers. He's I can't remember, Soviet medal of something. And then this is Haldane, JBS Haldane, who actually also was a communist. He was in England, but he became a communist. And he was not very happy with the British government. He actually moved to India because he was mad that they did something wrong in the Suez Canal, like abused people somehow. So anyway, why was it atheists who really led the way in the idea that life evolved from chemicals? Well, it was natural for them to believe that life had a natural origin because they had no other option. They didn't think God even existed. So they thought life must have originated from chemicals. So for that reason, atheists were the leaders. So Oparin wrote a very famous theoretical biochemical justification for natural origin of life in two papers in 1924 and 1938. And as with Darwin, he argued that organic chemicals could form naturally and thus life could form from organic chemicals. And one thing he said, which isn't true, he said there's no fundamental difference between living organisms and lifeless matter, which is not correct since life contains information. Oh, and here For his work, he was awarded the Medal for the Hero of Socialist Labor. So that's his medal there that he's wearing. Okay. And one thing I'd like to point out is, as with Lemaitre from the other philosophical point of view, and as much as people hate to admit it, people's core beliefs often lead them in their scientific endeavors. Sometimes people's beliefs lead them towards the truth, and other times people's beliefs lead them towards error and cause them not to see the truth. But it's very true that our assumptions and worldview affects our approach to whatever we're doing. And also, I'd like to point out that sometimes it takes a really strong belief in order to accomplish something. For example, scientists still haven't figured out the evolution of life from non-life, but they've made a lot of progress. And it might take this type of belief to cause you to keep going in the midst of, frustrating experiment after frustrating experiment. But in 1952, scientists made a huge advance. So Harold Urey at the University of Chicago was one of America's most brilliant scientists. And in 1952, graduate student Stanley Miller and Professor Urey applied electricity for several days to a mixture of water, hydrogen gas, ammonia, and methane. And they produced amino acids, nucleobases, and fatty acids. And it seemed like the discovery of a natural origin of life scenario was just around the corner. However, scientists discovered that amino acids in the environment don't naturally form into proteins. And there were other difficulties, such as the search for a natural origin of sugars, which are part of DNA and RNA. Nevertheless, Miller and Urey's experiment was significant because it was the first demonstration that biological functional groups could form in the natural environment. So I inserted this section because you need to have an understanding of the building blocks of life in order to understand the arguments regarding life's origins. And there's a really nice video in the chapter where a lady explains the different types of organic compounds, which are carbohydrates, lipids, nucleic acids, and proteins. And so these are arranged in various ways in the cell. So I'll just briefly go over them. This picture shows the double helix DNA that you've all seen, which is formed from nucleotides, which are here. And they're formed from a nitrogenous base, a sugar, and a phosphate. And sugars also are classified as carbohydrates, so that covers the carbohydrate section here. And you can, in the upper right image, you can see that DNA stores information by the arrangement of 4 slightly different nucleotides, and those are guanine, cytosine, thymine, and adenine. Okay, let's look at amino acids. So amino acids form proteins, and proteins are like the little machines in the cell that do work. And I just have one example here. On the right is a DNA strand, and it is decorated with all of these little RNAPs, RNA polymerases. And so this is an example of the protein called RNA polymerase. And you can see that it's very complex. All the proteins are extremely complex like this, maybe with 400 different amino acids all arranged in a certain way. And they get configured, and it makes them into a little machine that can do work. So in this case, RNA polymerase can unwind the DNA strand so that information can be extracted. And it uses another protein called helicase, and it unwinds the DNA strand at a rate of 10,000 rotations per second, which is just unbelievable to think about. Okay, the next category of organic compound is lipids. And lipids form cellular membranes. They have this hydrophobic um, and hydrophilic sides that lets them form these little structures here. You can see that there's two joined together. And that's what forms the membranes in your cells and in the organelles in your cells. And they naturally form these spheres that are like little balloons, but the balloons have water on the inside and water on the outside. And so inside your cells water and outside your cells water. And so that's what life is constructed of, these cellular membranes. And the amazing thing is that these spheres, as well as amino acids, which are used in proteins, were found on the Murchison meteorite. And so that indicates that these structures could form in space or on Earth. So the structure of the cell could naturally form in the environment, which is a huge thing as far as the origin of life goes. So after, we're getting back to origin of life here, after Miller and Urey's experiments in the 1950s formed amino acids, there was a long period of about half a century in which they couldn't figure out how sugars formed. And sugars are part of DNA and RNA. So there's no DNA and RNA without sugars. And they spent years in the laboratory trying to figure this out. I think many people spent their whole careers trying to figure out how sugar formed in the environment. And finally, in 2009, the Sutherland Laboratory in England found that a mix of sunlight, hydrogen cyanide, and hydrogen sulfide kicked off a process that led to sugars, RNA, and all other organic compounds required for life. And so you can see that it begins here with hydrogen sulfide, and it continues with hydrogen cyanide. And there's like, all these equations are in the chapter. There's like 9 of them. And so they called it cyanosulfidic chemistry. And you might think that this is overly complex and contrived and might only occur in a laboratory. But in a paper in 2015 by Patel, Sutherland, and others, they showed that there's a statistical likelihood for each of these processes in cyanosulfidic chemistry to occur. So there's a preferential path towards these reactions, which is extremely important for the idea that the scenario is plausible. Because in the world, there's billions of variations of organic chemicals. So all of them could combine. And so you need these certain chemicals to combine preferentially in order for life to form. Otherwise, cyanosulfidic chemistry is basically useless. So I think that this is a, it might not be exactly how it occurred. We don't know. But at least at this point, it has a plausible path towards the formation of the organic chemicals needed to form life. Okay, so one of the great questions for origin of life researchers has been whether life began with DNA and information storage or with proteins, which are the little machines that do the work in the cell. But they've already mentioned that proteins just naturally don't assemble into functional groups, or the amino acids don't even assemble together. But fortunately, there's an intermediate molecule that both stores information and does a limited amount of work in the cell, and that's RNA. So thus researchers propose that RNA was the first molecule that formed in life because it could store information and do work. And this scenario is called the RNA world hypothesis. So in this scenario, remember I showed you the nucleotides that are the building blocks of the RNA and DNA. In this scenario, nucleotides form naturally in the environment, which was shown in cyanosulfidic chemistry, or is possible. And then they would form short, what they call oligomers. So oligomers would have an oligomer that's 4 mers long, would be the first step. So forming from individual nucleotides to 4 nucleotides in a string. And the problem is that scientists cannot figure out how that happened. They're still working on experiments to go from here to here. One proposal is that they formed on like clay templates, which have like positive and opposite charges and so on. So they're still working on that. But once 4 nucleotides form short oligomers that are 4 mers long, then they naturally join together by recombination and form longer oligomers. I think they're up to like 100. And then researchers have also shown that by folding, that they can form double helixes, so or double-stranded ribozymes. So these steps have been demonstrated. And then the next proposed step, in order for evolution to occur, is that these certain RNA strands would be incorporated inside a cell. And so that would be the fatty acid vesicles that I showed you, the little balloons with water on the inside and outside. So if a fatty acid vesicle could contain the RNA strands, then if there was a preferential reason that some RNA strands were better than others, and if those could be duplicated as the fatty acid vesicles divided, which they do, then that would be the first step towards evolution, that you'd have this preferential or advantage to certain RNA strands, and then they're in a fatty acid vesicle, and then that divides, then that would just keep going. And so scientists think that once evolution begins, it would continue. This is as far as they've gotten so far. An RNA strands inside fatty acid vesicles, not really explaining how it would be preferential. But so we've gone from nothing to organic molecules form in the environment, to there's a way for sugar to form in other organic compounds, to RNA strands will join together, to RNA strands could be incorporated into fatty acid vesicles. So as one, I think as Sutherland said, we've reached the end of the beginning. So we've got a starting point. Probably, I don't even think they'll discover it in your lifetime, how life evolved. Maybe they will, maybe they're getting closer. But I remember the famous person who worked on fatty acid vesicles, Szostak, back in the 90s, said we're only a decade from proving how life evolved, when he first discovered these things or was working on them. So one thing I've learned is when there's something exciting going on, people make a lot of claims and you really shouldn't believe them. I learned that from being in the algae research business, where people thought they were going to make biofuel, which they do now, biofuel from algae. There was a lot of claims out there that weren't necessarily true. Not because they were trying to lie, but maybe they were just overly excited. I mean, some people were trying to lie because they wanted to get huge money for their algae biofuel companies. But you just have to be careful with claims. Like I'm in the irrigation business mostly, or have been, and there's no lies in irrigation. I mean, people have been irrigating for like 6,000 years, and you just never run up against people lying about what's happening because there's really no motivation to lie. Okay. Well, one proposal is that the fatty acid vesicles divided due to temperature changes. And so they've shown in the laboratory that the fatty acid vesicles will divide, if you have temperature changes or other factors. So they need the fatty acid vesicles to divide. So one proposal is that the division first occurred in a lake with hydrothermal vents. So there'd be this cycle of the water going up to the hydrothermal vent and then going away and going up and getting hotter and colder. This is Yellowstone Lake, where they have hydrothermal vents. So that's one scenario for the division of fatty acid vesicles. Another is maybe on beaches, maybe day and night. So that's an active area of research also. Okay, anyway, let's leave origin of life and at least the first part of it. And we'll move on to the first cells. So they found cells in the early Archean, like 3.8 billion. Well, they haven't found cells 3.8 billion years ago. They found chemical evidence of life 3.8 billion years ago. And then the first cells they've seen, I think, are 3.5 billion years ago. But they were these little bacteria. So this is a relatively simple form of life, bacteria. There's no nucleus. There's no organelles. So these early forms of life were classified as bacteria and archaea. But even though it's relatively simple compared to other forms of life like animals and plants, you can see that there's a huge gap between this and the picture I showed you on the last slides, where we had RNA strands inside fatty acid vesicle. So in fact, it could not be more enormous, the difference between this organism and a fatty acid vesicle with RNA strands. So in my opinion, there's quite a bit of room for people to have different philosophical viewpoints about the origin of life. We really haven't proven that the origin of life was natural. So really, if somebody believed God created life, they're not violating any scientific principles there or any scientific discoveries. You know, you could believe either way depending on your point of view. So you know, it's important to realize that all we know about is this huge gap. I mean, we know some things about the beginning possibly, and then we know what we find in the fossil record. So there's still a lot of room for different points of view. So the early life, there's a lot of uncertainty about that, as you can imagine. I mean, you have these little tiny impressions in rocks where cells were. So that's our information. And so they really aren't sure about whether bacteria were first, archaea were first, or whatever. But they do know that they got their energy from different types of chemical reactions, possibly based on chemical evidence. And so the three ways that early cells obtain their energy were chemical reactions, consuming other biological material, or obtaining energy from the sun through photosynthesis. And the next step was the evolution of plant cells. So here's a prokaryote that I showed you in the last slide. And then you can see in the plant cells, there's a nucleus and there's organelles, such as the mitochondria and also the chloroplasts, which do photosynthesis. So they incorporated it into themselves. And there's various scenarios. I'm sorry, they incorporated other cells into themselves. And that's a process called endosymbiosis. And there's a lot of strong evidence for that, such as the DNA in chloroplasts is almost exactly the same as the DNA in cyanobacteria, which live out in the environment. There's like 6 sources of evidence for it. But they really don't know how they all combined. They don't know the sequence. They don't know what was first. So there's various proposals on how the sequence of endosymbiosis, where some things were incorporated into other things. One thing to know, this picture doesn't really show, is that the plant and animal cells like these are about 100 times larger than the bacteria. So they're much larger cells. One of the quests of origin of life researchers is to figure out how early cells might have obtained energy. I mean, obviously, we don't have the advanced photosynthetic system that we have today in plants. So this is an example of one organism they found. It'll live in extremely salty lakes. Basically, this is an archaea, which can't compete with bacteria. So they get eliminated. But if there's a really salty place or a hot place where aerobic life and bacteria can't exist, then they can exist there. This is called Halobacterium halobium. And you can see that the protein, which is called bacteriorhodopsin, is embedded in the membrane. And when a photon from the sun strikes bacteriorhodopsin, it sends hydrogen into the cell. And then that would build up a hydrogen gradient, which would force hydrogen out through another protein called ATP. And that spins the little ATP motor, and that enables the ATP motor to convert ADP to ATP, which is a source of energy. So they look for these simple kinds of photosynthetic systems that might have been early. And then, of course, through evolution, you could build on that. Okay, and this diagram shows photosynthetic proteins embedded in the thylakoid membrane of the chloroplast in cells. And I'll show you a picture of that in the next slide. So there's all these membranes, and this is the photosynthetic system. There's photosystem 1 and photosystem 2. And researchers at Imperial College recently discovered or asserted that photosystem 2 on the left was first, and that can be traced back to the earliest photosynthetic light. So you can see that what's happening is there's light here hitting a photon, hitting the protein, and then water is converted to hydrogen ion and oxygen. And so that's the beginning of the photosynthetic pathway where photosynthesis develops energy for plants, and then we consume plants, and that's where we get our energy. So this whole system is where all the energy comes for life. And so this was maybe back 3.5 billion years ago. But then over the next 1.5 billion years, until the beginning of the Proterozoic Eon, which is when the atmosphere became oxidized, so that would indicate higher efficiency photosynthesis, this all evolved. And this is extremely complex, as you can imagine. Remember how complex each of the proteins was? So, maybe 1.5 billion years would be needed to evolve something as complicated as this. And actually, this was the first great mass extinction in life's history, because once the atmosphere is oxidized, most of the archaea all died. So that was the end of the archaea, except for like lakes in Yellowstone. Actually, there's some in our gut too that do certain things. Okay, and so these are cyanobacteria, which there might be evidence of them like 3.5 billion years ago in little impressions in rocks, and also in these layered things that I can't remember the name of right now, but they would build up, and then the other bacteria would grow on top of them, and then they would build up. So anyway, these little guys produce half the world's oxygen. It's pretty amazing. And so they were incorporated eventually as the chloroplast in plants. So this is the chloroplast organelle in plants that produces photosynthesis for the plant cell. And just one thing of interest, these chloroplasts are pretty big. I mean, they're not like thousands of them in a plant cell. There's like only 1 or 2. But there's many of those thylakoid membranes inside the chloroplast. So there's many of those photosynthesis sites inside the chloroplast. Okay, and then after cyanobacteria, there was red and green algae that evolved. And they probably appeared about 1.9 billion years ago. So they're in the fossil record. And so these green algae are the ancestors of land plants. And this is one of those papers I referred to on molecular clocks, where they're looking at all the different green algae species, and they can track like which one evolved from which one. And so I think in this paper, they said that they think that land plants are between 500 and 700 million years old. It might have been a different paper. And if you're interested in more on green algae, there's many types. I did some videos on green algae. for a class, but I also spent like 8 or 10 years researching how to grow green algae. I was more the engineer, like controlling the temperature and modeling how fast they grow and so on. But I have a few videos on green algae and biofuels at the Cosmos Sona site. And or maybe I got that 500 to 700 million year number. I just typed it into AI. When did land plants evolve? So this is a little description. It says between 700 and 500 million years ago. And they describe the discrepancy between fossils and the molecular clocks. Okay, let's look at philosophical and religious perspectives on the origin of life. This is certainly an interesting topic. I mean, we've all heard all the arguments. So, yeah, so as I mentioned before, I already described atheists. They were the first to get the ball rolling on origin of life research. And still, I think a lot of biologists who work on evolution are atheists. It's just the impression you get. So theistic evolutionists believe that God set up the universe to form life from chemicals. Thus, they basically have the same perspective as atheists on the natural origin of life from chemicals. They don't think that God needed to intervene in the origin of life after the beginning of the universe. And then progressive creationists generally believe that God miraculously created the first life, and that it then either evolved or God periodically stepped in and created new kingdoms, phyla, and orders of life over time. And many progressive creationists teach that the origin of life is proof of the existence of God. However, I don't think Moses ever made that claim. And also, you have to think that all these theologians for 2,000 years all thought life evolved from non-life or spontaneously originated. So I question why they're so adamant about that. And from my perspective, I don't really care. But I do think that these indications of these progressions, like cyanosulfidic chemistry, the ability of RNA to form longer strands, the discovery of fatty acid vesicles in the environment, to me, they indicate that life evolved naturally. I mean, it's pretty improbable with billions of organic chemicals that you'd have these preferential pathways towards things occurring. That's what I think. And then, of course, young Earth creationists, they don't believe in this at all. They believe all living beings were created as they are by God in their present form. So they don't believe that, let's say, birds or mammals evolved from amphibians, or they don't have any interest in talking about protocells, whether they formed naturally or not. Okay, and let's go back to Guyot. So Guyot believed that the third day of creation referenced the formation of photosynthetic life after the formation of the earth. And although there were no plants in the fossil record at the time, he thought that Moses might be referring to microbial algae, which there is evidence of in geologic formations. And he was a geologist, so he'd seen examples of this. And he lived right after Pasteur, and he did not believe that life could evolve on its own, as did anybody else at the time. And he said, well, even though Moses didn't say that God created life, he said God created animals on the fifth day, and that applies to the third day. So he was criticized for those interpretations and also for saying that algae qualified as plants. They said there's no way that this verse could possibly refer to algae, but now we see in molecular clock studies that it's likely that there were plants in the Precambrian prior to animals. So once again, Guyot's critics were not off base in their criticisms of his interpretation. But the funny thing is that modern science has directly answered their legitimate concerns. All right, we'll see you next time.